What if the most influential family in the history of global economics is one you have never heard of? A dynasty that shaped currencies, redirected empires, and engineered trade systems long before names like Goldman or Rothschild ever appeared in a textbook. And what if everything we consider modern financial logic, from debt cycles to commodity manipulation, was built on the blueprint they quietly created generations ago? The world believes powerful banks built the economic order, but this family operated before the banks, above the banks, and in a way that made governments dependent on their networks without ever understanding the full extent of the influence they were enabling. Why does a single dynasty, hidden behind merchants, brokers, and trade routes, keep appearing at the turning points of global history? Why did their strategies survive empires, revolutions, and changing currencies, while others collapsed under their own weight? To understand how they did this, you need to step into a world where naval routes were more important than stock exchanges, where empires fought over ports instead of spreadsheets, and where information moved through private family networks faster than any government courier system. This family mastered the mechanics of scarcity, demand, logistics, and political leverage long before these concepts had formal names. They understood that controlling a product was never as profitable as controlling the flow, and controlling the flow was never as powerful as controlling the people who depended on it. Their rise was not accidental. It was engineered through strategy, precision, and a ruthless understanding of how human behavior responds to profit, fear, and opportunity. And once you see the pattern they created, you will recognize it repeating across centuries, including today. But before we dive deeper, I want to know something from you. Have you ever looked at global economics and felt like the real story was missing, like the headlines only show the surface while the true forces remain invisible? If any part of this already speaks to you, drop a comment sharing what you have noticed in your own life or studies. And while you're here, make sure you leave a like to help this message reach more people, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss the next parts of this investigation, because what you will uncover next may challenge everything you thought you knew about how power really works. To understand how a dynasty like this could rise to such influence, you need to look at the world they were born into, because nothing about their ascent makes sense until you grasp the economic landscape that quietly shaped them. Long before modern finance existed, empires were held together by unstable trade routes, unreliable tax systems, and a constant struggle to keep their military expansions funded. The global economy was not driven by markets, but by scarcity, monopolies, and the desperate need for empires to maintain access to strategic commodities. In this fragile environment, opportunity did not emerge through brute force or political charisma. It emerged through those who could understand the gaps, the inefficiencies, the vulnerabilities baked into every empire that tried to control too much territory with too little administrative capacity. This family recognized earlier than anyone else that the real power of the age did not lie in royal courts or military ranks. It lived in the ports, in the warehouses, in the merchant networks that quietly sustained entire economies without ever appearing in official records. They saw that empires depended on predictable flows of goods, but those flows were constantly disrupted by war, taxation, weather, corruption, and bureaucratic delays. By positioning themselves at key points in these fragile corridors, they were not just trading commodities. They were stabilizing entire regions, often doing for governments what governments could not do for themselves. And in return, they gained something more valuable than money. They gained trust, access, and protection from authorities who needed them more than they would ever publicly admit. Every empire of the period struggled with the same structural weakness. They knew how to conquer territory, but they did not know how to run efficient economies. This family filled that void with an understanding of supply chains that was centuries ahead of its time. They mapped the movement of goods across seas, anticipated shortages before officials even noticed them, and built informal alliances that transcended borders. They learned to move information faster than the couriers of kings. They mastered the art of offering solutions before problems became visible, making themselves essential to rulers who believed they were the ones in control. In truth, they had already surrendered part of their authority to a merchant network that understood the rhythm of the world better than any government body could. And this is the turning point, the moment where their story shifts from simple merchants to architects of influence. Once they realized empires were dependent on them, they no longer acted as silent partners. They began shaping the very systems those empires relied on, guiding policies, nudging decisions, and weaving themselves into the economic fabric so deeply that removing them would have meant destabilizing entire regions. The foundation of their global power began, here in a world unprepared for the sophistication of a family that saw economics not as transactions, but as leverage waiting to be used. As their influence expanded, the family moved beyond simply navigating trade routes and began constructing something far more sophisticated, the early blueprint of international logistics and financial integration. Most merchants of the era operated in isolation, reacting to market shifts as they occurred. This family did the opposite. They engineered the dot-button shifts. They understood that controlling isolated transactions was trivial compared to controlling the mechanisms that made those transactions possible. So they built networks that linked ports, warehouses, shipping fleets, lending operations, and political intermediaries into a single ecosystem that functioned almost like a parallel economy, one that governments depended on but never fully understood. Their mastery came from seeing the world as a system long before anyone else treated it that way. They recognized that if you could anticipate where demand would spike, where supply would falter, where political instability would interrupt trade, you could position yourself not as a participant, but as the invisible coordinator of the entire flow. They negotiated exclusive agreements with regional authorities, securing privileges that allowed them to bypass common trading restrictions. They standardized weights, measures, packaging, and pricing structures across their domains, effectively creating the earliest forms of global consistency in a world defined by fragmentation. And because their operations were reliable, rulers tolerated their growing power even when it exceeded what was comfortable. But it was their financial innovation that truly set them apart. They developed credit systems that allowed goods to move months before payment was due, enabling them to dominate long-distance commerce where other traders lacked the capital to survive the delays. They provided loans to shipbuilders, farmers, regional governors, and military commanders, often with terms designed not to maximize interest, but to ensure loyalty and dependence. When storms destroyed crops or conflicts disrupted markets, they became the stabilizers. When empires needed rapid financing for diplomacy or war, they acted faster than official treasuries. Their reach extended across borders, cultures, and political systems, creating a network that no single empire could claim to. Control. In time, their ships carried more than goods. They carried information. They learned which regions were preparing for conflict, which leaders were rising or falling, which currencies were weakening, and which shortages were emerging long before such news reached imperial capitals. This intelligence advantage allowed them to shift resources instantly, reroute fleets, and influence pricing across continents. They did not merely move with the market. The market bent around their decisions. And as each decade passed, governments realized that removing them from the equation was no longer an option. They had become too embedded, too essential, too strategically positioned for any empire to challenge without risking economic paralysis. This was the moment their transformation became irreversible. What began as logistical efficiency had evolved into structural dominance, and from that point on, they were not responding to global dynamics. They were shaping them. As their reach expanded across continents, the family began to operate in a realm far beyond commerce. They stepped into the shadows, where empires negotiated influence, where governors sought quiet favors, and where policy was shaped long before it appeared in official decrees. Their power no longer came merely from controlling goods or information, but from embedding themselves into the decision-making machinery of the world's dominant powers. They discovered that influence was most effective when it appeared informal, when it moved through personal relationships rather than public institutions, when it allowed rulers to believe they were acting independently even as they followed economic currents, subtly guided by the family's network. Their partnerships with imperial authorities were rarely explicit. They offered support, funding, ships, and intelligence at crucial moments, creating a dynamic where rulers depended on them without ever acknowledging the depth of that dependence. When regional conflicts threatened supply lines, they provided logistical solutions that governments could not mobilize in time. When fiscal crises emerged, they extended credit quietly, preventing collapses that would have destabilized entire territories. These interventions earned them privileges no ordinary merchant could dream of: protected trade corridors, reduced tariffs, diplomatic immunity under the guise of necessity, and access to the political elite that went far beyond commercial negotiation. But the real innovation was the way they leveraged these relationships to create structural influence. They advised governors on which regions to prioritize, which rival merchants to suppress, which local leaders to empower, and which trade regulations would best serve stability, a word that conveniently aligned with their own profitability. They became indispensable intermediaries between empires and the territories they struggled to control. Their interests became woven into policy decisions, sometimes subtly shifting the balance of power without the rulers realizing who had guided their hand. The family understood that power is rarely seized outright. It is accumulated through 1,000 small dependencies until removing it feels impossible. Over time, states began modeling parts of their administrative systems on the family's methods. Uniform pricing schemes, standardized taxation on goods, predictable shipping schedules, and even rudimentary insurance models all mirrored structures the family had implemented decades earlier. Their influence was so deeply embedded that officials often believed these innovations originated within the empire itself. Yet behind closed doors, Correspondence, accounting records, and private agreements revealed a very different truth. The empires were adopting the family's framework because it worked more efficiently than their own, and this marked a profound shift. They were no longer observers of imperial policy. They were quiet architects guiding decisions that shaped economies far larger than their own enterprise. Every agreement strengthened their leverage. Every privileged corridor reinforced their indispensability, and every official who relied on their system became another node in a network that operated beneath the surface of global power. Before we continue deeper into how they use this influence, I want to hear from you. Which part of this hidden partnership between private power and imperial authority strikes you the most, and why do you think such arrangements have survived through centuries? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore this pattern together. As their influence seeped deeper into the political machinery of multiple empires, the family shifted from facilitating markets to subtly engineering them. They understood something most officials never fully grasped. Markets do not move on supply and demand alone. They move on perception, expectation, fear, and the controlled release of information. This insight allowed the family to manipulate entire regions without ever appearing as the source of the shift. Instead of competing within the market, they shaped the parameters of the market itself, making their position unchallenged even by rivals with comparable wealth but far less structural leverage. They began orchestrating scarcity not through brute force, but through timing. A delay in shipments created temporary shortages that raised prices. A sudden surge of inventory destabilized competitors who lacked the capacity to respond quickly. Strategic withholding of information about weather patterns, harvest yields, or trade disruptions allowed them to anticipate price movements before officials or merchants even realized what was happening. These tactics were subtle enough to remain invisible, yet powerful enough to ripple across borders. Governments accused foreign rivals, blamed natural conditions, or pointed fingers at internal mismanagement, never realizing that the quiet recalibration stemmed from a network operating beneath their awareness. Their manipulation extended to currency flows as well. In regions where coin shortages threatened trade, they introduced credit instruments that stabilized local economies while making those economies dependent on their approval. In places where currency inflation weakened purchasing power, they shifted payments into alternative stores of value, positioning themselves as the only reliable intermediary between collapsing systems and the merchants who needed stability to survive. Their financial strategies allowed them to smooth volatility for some regions while amplifying it in others, always with the intention of guiding markets toward outcomes that strengthened their own position. They also mastered the psychological landscape of commerce. By fostering trust among specific communities and withholding it from others, they controlled the flow of opportunity long before economic models quantified such behavior. They created reputational hierarchies that opened doors for allies and quietly closed them for rivals. They influenced which groups were considered reliable partners and which were treated as risks, embedding themselves in the cultural logic of trade. Over time, the family became not just a participant in commercial life, but a reference point, a standard by which other merchants were judged. Their interventions were rarely dramatic. Instead, they accumulated in layers. A suggestion to an official, a well-timed shipment, an abrupt change in credit terms, a rumor that influenced a governor's decision. These seemingly minor actions compounded until entire sectors moved according to rhythms the family set. Their ability to steer outcomes without appearing to touch them gave them an advantage no public institution could match. They operated with the subtlety of natural forces, shaping environments rather than individual events. And by the time anyone recognized the pattern, the dependency was already too deep to unwind. The rise of this strategic manipulation marked a turning point in their evolution. They were no longer responding to the economic world. They were beginning to script it. As their control over information and logistics matured, the family's influence expanded into the realm that true power always gravitates toward: crisis. They understood earlier than anyone that instability was not merely a risk to be avoided, but a force that could be shaped, directed, and harvested. Empires feared shortages, conflicts, currency collapses, and regional unrest because these events threatened their legitimacy. The family, however, saw in these disruptions an opportunity to tighten their grip on the systems that governments struggled to manage. Their advantage was simple. They had mobility, they had liquidity, and most importantly, they had foresight. When crop failures hit key territories, they were the first to mobilize alternate supply routes. They did not do this out of charity. They did it because stepping in during moments of weakness ensured that entire regions became dependent on their intervention. Officials praised them publicly, not realizing that the same network that brought relief had also anticipated the crisis in advance, positioning warehouses and fleets in ways that allowed them to dictate prices while appearing as saviors. When wars disrupted land transport, they shifted to maritime channels they already controlled. When taxation policies destabilized markets, they offered private credit facilities that acted as lifelines, drawing governments deeper into their orbit. Some crises were natural, others geopolitical, and a few were quietly encouraged. They understood how to exploit tension between neighboring territories by selectively choosing which region received goods first, creating subtle imbalances that strained alliances and reshaped power relations. They learned that withholding shipments for even a short period could trigger sudden inflation, weaken a governor's standing, or create demand that only they could satisfy. These maneuvers were invisible to the public, yet they altered the trajectories of entire provinces. Financial crises, however, became their most effective arena. When currencies faltered, governments often panicked, imposing restrictions that inadvertently strengthened the family's position. Their private stores of precious metals allowed them to stabilize transactions when official tender was questioned. Their long-distance credit instruments became the only trustworthy medium of exchange in periods when confidence in government currency evaporated. Merchants, unable to rely on state institutions, turned to the family for settlement and guarantees, effectively shifting economic authority away from governments and toward a private network that transcended national boundaries. Even when crises escalated into violent conflict, the family adapted. They supplied both sides indirectly through intermediaries, ensuring that no matter which faction emerged victorious, the new leadership would inherit obligations tied to their financial arrangements. Their neutrality was not moral, but strategic. By avoiding political alignment, they maintained flexibility and preserved their assets across regime changes that destroyed the fortunes of others. These cycles of turmoil did not weaken them. They reinforced their role as the one constant in a world defined by volatility. Officials changed, borders shifted, rulers fell, but the family remained indispensable because crises made states vulnerable, and vulnerability made influence easier to secure. Every upheaval left behind a landscape more dependent on their systems than before, and as each decade passed, it became evident that their true mastery was not in surviving instability, but in shaping how instability redistributed power. As the family's influence expanded across continents, the human cost of their decisions began to spread far beyond the ledgers that recorded their profits. Every manipulation of supply, every engineered scarcity, every financial maneuver that strengthened their position carried consequences for the people living under the systems they quietly controlled. Entire regions found their daily lives shaped not by local governance or tradition, but by decisions made in distant counting rooms by individuals who would never witness the suffering their strategies created. The family understood that power always extracts a price, and in their case, the price was measured in instability, dependence, and the erosion of communities that once sustained themselves without external interference. In areas where they created artificial shortages to influence pricing, families endured hunger and privation without ever knowing why the goods they relied on had suddenly become unreachable. When they shifted credit terms to consolidate control, small merchants fell into cycles of debt that reshaped local economies for generations. In territories destabilized by their selective distribution of resources, political tensions flared, igniting conflicts that rulers blamed on ethnic rivalries or foreign agitation, never imagining that subtle supply imbalances had pushed fragile societies past their breaking point. These disruptions did not appear as acts of manipulation. They appeared as fate, misfortune, or the inevitable hardship of living under vast empires. Their financial strategies created a different kind of dependency, one that eroded self-sufficiency. Communities that once traded locally were drawn into distant markets whose rules they neither understood nor influenced. Local currencies weakened as people adopted credit instruments issued by the family's network, slowly transferring authority away from regional governments and into private hands. This shift hollowed out traditional economic structures, leaving populations vulnerable to fluctuations engineered far beyond their sight. And when crises struck, those same communities turned to the family for relief, unaware that the conditions leading to their desperation had been shaped by the very system providing their salvation. Even the political structures of these societies were altered. Leaders who relied on the family for credit or stability found themselves forced to adopt policies that prioritized trade corridors and financial flows over the needs of their own people. Decisions that appeared pragmatic from a governmental perspective often deepened inequality, displacing vulnerable groups, while enriching intermediaries aligned with the family's interests. Over time, the social fabric frayed as economic pressures amplified divisions, reshaped class structures, and redirected local ambitions away from communal resilience and toward external dependency. Yet the most profound impact was psychological. Populations began to internalize the belief that their fortunes were subject to forces beyond their control, that prosperity and hardship were determined not by their labor or governance, but by distant actors manipulating unseen levers. This erosion of agency weakened societies in ways no military conquest could achieve. A people who no longer believe they can influence their future are far easier to control, far easier to reshape, and far easier to absorb into systems designed to benefit distant elites. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Which part of this hidden human cost strikes you most, and why do you think societies fail to recognize these patterns until it is already too late? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can dive deeper into this dynamic. As the family's influence deepened, the economic structures they engineered began to evolve into something far more enduring than simple trade dominance. Their innovations laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern financial architecture. Governments believed they were borrowing tools from experienced merchants, but in reality, they were adopting mechanisms that fundamentally shifted where authority over economic life resided. The family's systems were efficient, reliable, and adaptable, but they also embedded dependencies that gradually transferred power away from political institutions and into privately controlled structures operating beyond public oversight. One of their most transformative contributions was the normalization of credit as the primary engine of expansion. Before their intervention, empires relied heavily on taxation, plunder, and sporadic loans negotiated through aristocratic networks. These methods were slow, unpredictable, and vulnerable to political turbulence. The family introduced standardized credit instruments that allowed states, merchants, and regional authorities to borrow against future production with unprecedented confidence. These instruments circulated across borders, forming early prototypes of international debt markets. What made them truly revolutionary was not their design, but the way they conditioned governments to operate on perpetual borrowing rather than accumulated reserves. This shift also altered currency behavior. In regions where coinage fluctuated wildly in purity or availability, the family's credit notes became the de facto medium of exchange. They were stable, trusted, and recognized in territories that otherwise lacked monetary cohesion. Over time, entire economies began to function on dual systems: the official currency used for symbolic transactions, and the family's instruments used for real commerce. This duality foreshadowed the modern divide between nominal monetary policy and the private credit markets that actually drive global liquidity. Their role in institutional standardization was equally profound. They developed unified accounting practices, shipping documentation, insurance mechanisms, and dispute resolution, frameworks that spread across continents. These innovations were not merely administrative conveniences, they created interoperability between distant economies. Rulers adopted these systems because they reduced friction and increased revenue. But the underlying consequence was that economic coordination began to flow through the family's network rather than through imperial bureaucracies. When governments experienced disruptions, the family's systems kept functioning, reinforcing the belief that private structures were more reliable than public ones. Even taxation evolved under their influence. By structuring trade corridors that maximized predictable flows, they indirectly shaped how empires assessed duties, calculated export values, and defined taxable categories. Some states even modeled their fiscal calendars around shipping cycles introduced by the family, aligning national policy with private logistics. This inversion of influence was subtle, but it ensured that the family's operational rhythm became the rhythm of entire economies. The deeper significance of these developments becomes clear only in hindsight. Their systems outlasted the empires they served. When regimes collapsed, their logistical frameworks persisted. When currencies failed, their credit instruments adapted. When political orders fractured, their networks reassembled around new centers of authority. They had effectively built the scaffolding upon which future financial institutions would be constructed. The DNA of modern banking, multinational trade agreements, and global credit markets can be traced back to the principles they established centuries earlier. Their legacy was not a single invention, but an entire ecosystem, one that allowed economic power to migrate away from states and into transnational structures that operated according to rules the family had defined long before anyone recognized the implications. What makes their legacy so striking is not simply the innovations they introduced, but how thoroughly those innovations embedded themselves into the global systems we still rely on today. Long after their ships disappeared from harbors and their ledgers stopped recording the rhythms of trade, the structures they engineered continued to operate silently, shaping the world's economic behavior with a kind of momentum that no single empire could reverse. Modern institutions often believe they reinvented these mechanisms through enlightenment, rationalization, or technological progress. Yet the underlying logic traces directly back to the family's original framework, one built to outlast political eras and thrive in environments far larger than any ruler could comprehend. Their influence persists in the way states manage public debt. The assumption that governments must borrow continuously to sustain their operations originated not from constitutional debates or economic theory, but from the family's demonstration that liquidity and expansion depend on perpetual credit rather than finite reserves. Today, nations issue bonds, refinance deficits, and rely on rolling debt structures, because centuries ago, the family proved that an economy built on anticipated value could grow faster and bind more actors together than one dependent solely on stored wealth. Modern central banks follow similar rhythms, not because of historical necessity, but because the architecture designed by these early financiers made it nearly impossible to operate otherwise. Their imprint is also visible in global trade, standardized documentation, predictable shipping cycles, port of origin taxation, and even modern logistics hubs echo practices the family refined when empires struggled to maintain consistency across vast territories. The idea that trade must flow through coordinated pathways supported by unified administrative systems began as a private strategy, not a governmental one. When today's supply chains falter, the weaknesses exposed mirror the vulnerabilities the family learned to exploit and mitigate centuries earlier. The world continues to operate inside corridors they helped blueprint, even though most people have never heard their name. Financial markets reflect their deeper legacy as well. The notion that information is the most valuable commodity in economic life, and that those who control the flow of information control the outcomes of markets, emerged from the family's early intelligence networks. Long before electronic trading or regulatory agencies existed, they demonstrated how subtle shifts in perception could realign entire regions. They proved that stability could be engineered, volatility could be triggered, and pricing could be influenced without overt intervention. Modern investment banks may believe they pioneered these techniques, but the philosophical foundation was laid long before stock exchanges became symbols of economic power. Perhaps most enduring is the idea that economic influence must transcend nationality. The family operated across borders not because they sought secrecy, but because they understood that dependence is strongest when it is distributed. Today's multinational corporations, offshore financial centers, and global credit institutions reflect that same logic. They are not loyal to any one state because the family demonstrated that true resilience comes from being indispensable to all and subordinate to none. And so, even though their ships no longer dominate, trade routes and their private correspondence no longer dictates policy from behind the scenes, the world operates inside the architecture they left behind. Their systems became so efficient, so adaptable, and so profitable that they survived regime changes, wars, revolutions, and the rise of completely new forms of governance. Their legacy is not a story of individuals, but a blueprint that still defines the economic order we assume is natural. When you look closely at the economic systems operating around us today, it becomes clear that the world did not simply evolve into its current shape. It was guided, structured, and refined through patterns established long before nations formalized their financial doctrines. The family's influence did not vanish when their name faded from public memory. Instead, it dissolved into the very mechanisms that global economies now treat as foundational truths. Nations issue debt as though the practice is inseparable from governance. Markets move according to information flows no central authority truly controls. Trade networks operate on standardized principles that no single state created. These are not coincidences. They are the echoes of a framework deliberately constructed to outlive its architects. Their greatest achievement may have been the normalization of private power functioning within public systems. Today, we take for granted that corporations operate across borders, that private institutions can influence monetary policy, and that global finance answers to forces larger than national legislation. But this mindset originated when the family demonstrated that resilience and influence come from decentralization, adaptability, and strategic neutrality. Modern financial giants follow this model instinctively, spreading their operations across jurisdictions, insulating themselves from political shifts, and embedding their services so deeply into public infrastructure that governments cannot function without them. The world believes this is the natural progression of capitalism, yet its roots stretch back to a dynasty that mastered these dynamics centuries before economic theory caught up. Their legacy also persists in the quiet assumption that economic systems are too complex to be fully understood by the public. This belief did not emerge from academic discourse. It emerged from a time when the family's operations were intentionally obscured beneath layers of intermediaries, agents, and coded correspondence. The opacity served them well. It allowed them to shape outcomes without drawing attention, to profit from crises without appearing responsible, and to maintain continuity across shifting political landscapes. Today, financial institutions operate with similar opacity, using complexity as both a shield and a tool. The public sees the surface, but the real mechanisms remain hidden, just as they were in the family's time. And yet, despite the centuries between us and them, the core pattern remains unchanged. The world's economic order is shaped not by those who appear powerful, but by those who create the systems others must operate within. The family understood that influence is not about domination. It is about designing the environment in which decisions are made. Once you control the framework, the outcomes follow naturally. If you have followed this story until now, it means you are someone who sees beyond surface narratives and wants to understand the forces that actually shape our world. If that is you, let me know by leaving a comment with the phrase, "I see the pattern," so I know you stayed with me until the end. And if this exploration has given you new insight into how global power operates, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue diving into these hidden dynamics with me. While you are here, a simple like helps push this message to more people who are looking for clarity in a system that often feels opaque. And if you want to continue this journey, there is another video right beside this one that expands on these ideas and connects them to the financial structures we navigate today. Click on it and keep going. The story does not end here.